Social media has had a double standard for quite a long time. I mean, I'm not saying anything new there from mentioning that, but I do have a couple stories to mention, and ones which really prove without a shadow of a doubt the things that everyone has been assuming is the case for quite a long time. And the first, of course, is the story which has been not so overlooked of the two stories that are here, though both of them have, what with the California recall elections going on, the Met Gala, and all that sort of stuff. These stories have not gotten as much attention as they really deserve. The first one is, of course, where the New York Times obtained a report saying that the FEC is going to let off Twitter for doing obvious elections meddling in banning the Hunter Biden story, which was, of course, completely true. And this New York Times article is particularly interesting because, first of all, it starts to claim that, well, it was an unsupported story from the New York Post, which is utterly untrue. It was proven correct at the time. Later on, just a few months later, and even later on, you see more evidence and different sources complaining and showing the exact same thing, including one of Hunter Biden's own, well, you might say co-conspirators, Tony Blinken, coming out and saying precisely what the laptop was saying. And this is something which has gone on for a while, where the media will say this thing, which is just true, is unsubstantiated, basically because they don't believe any of the sources of which there are actually evidence. Now, this is not actually baseless. That's not the definition of the term, at least not in any reasonable sense, but it is what they use. And the funniest thing about this particular New York Times article to me is not actually that, but rather its defense of Twitter. Because, of course, the New York Times would be on the side of Twitter because they were on the side of Twitter at the time. And the claim from the FEC is that, well, Twitter had a viable commercial reason for banning this article. What that commercial reason was, it would probably have lessened the amount of tweets made in any given time, I can't even know. But what the claim is that it was based on existing hacked materials policy. But, and here's the funny thing here, is that hacked materials policy is less a hacked materials policy than an unauthorized release policy. If you actually read it, what it says is that any unauthorized release of materials is, in fact, a hacked material under the context here, which would, of course, apply to this exact New York Times article, because this is not based on an FEC report that has been released to the public. The New York Times obtained this report from someone who had knowledge of the FEC's findings. Now, I trust them in this instance, because the New York Times is generally good on this sort of story when they're just a few days ahead of an announcement coming out of the Biden administration, particularly since they're on the side of what's happening here. So it's not saying I don't trust the report, but it is, under Twitter's definition, a hacked material because the FEC has not yet authorized the release of such things, which shows the double standard which Twitter takes here, because the article I found on Twitter, completely fine, not banned at all, while the New York Post story was out for about a week without anyone being able to post it, even on their own. Even in direct messages, you could not send the link to the New York Times story, or New York Post story, unless you went through an archive, which generally I do as well. All of my links in the description are always archived to my sources. But this isn't the only example of a double standard, and it's not even the most explicit, because a story which has been woefully unreported, especially in the right-wing media, is a story that shows exactly what Facebook has been doing to have a double standard. Something that they call their exemptions program, or something to that effect. At a certain point in time, it was in fact called shielding. And this report from the Wall Street Journal, which, hey, they sometimes do some good reporting, shows exactly how Facebook's systems work to make certain accounts basically able to violate the rules with impunity. This manifests itself in certain famous people being able to post pornography and specifically revenge porn and have that stay up for millions of people to see before the algorithm, or before a person actually manually goes in, because the algorithm is actually banned from dealing with these accounts, whatever they are. And these accounts are constantly growing. There are millions of accounts that are basically immune to every single Facebook rule. This is why you can see every time that, say, the CDC or Dr. Fauci or someone who is pro-coronatarianism posting willful disinformation, things which are deemed as misinformation by Facebook independent fact checkers, be able to post it with impunity, while someone who is, say, John Stossel, posting things that are objectively correct or things that are simply reporting on what other people believe, have their claims being shown as misinformation or other such things, despite no such rulings seemingly even existing. This is the problem with basically all social media of the legacy tech variety. This is the problem because fundamentally they have a lot of big people on these big tech sites, and they have a lot of, well, let's say, obligations to a lot of these people, especially when they're being funded in large part by the government, which is a lot of these trusted accounts and such. This is why they have these systems to begin with. The reason they need them is because otherwise they'd step on the toes of all sorts of government agencies and all sorts of government people who are, well, funding them. And no, I'm not in favor of many of these rules in the first place, of course. Many of these rules are just simply, well, awful. But it's worth it to mention that's why the double standard exists, because otherwise the algorithm can't make a differential between misinformation from a right-winger or misinformation from the mainstream news. They can't make that distinction because the words are the same. The algorithm, while it is obviously biased, it's not so biased that it can see one word from one source and one word from another source and be able to differentiate it without these sorts of systems put in place. And this is the major problem of big tech. And this is a system which, of course, many of the plebeians are not involved in. Of course, not unless you have an in Facebook or in Twitter or in any of these places. You don't have these sorts of protections on any of these websites, and their policies are so vague and basically not understandable that it's not a surprise when you end up with all of these sorts of examples of completely disparate enforcement on every single one of these legacy media sites. It's not surprising at all. And these stories are worth it to put out there. I really do suggest you go down in the description and read the full report because, well, in a 7-minute video, I'm not going to be covering everything that was mentioned in either. So I do suggest you read both of these articles, the New York Times one for a laugh and the Wall Street Journal one to get angry, but that is an important thing to do, to read all these articles to understand what's going on. Especially when it goes under the radar, like it has been in the case of these two stories. Much of this has not been covered basically anywhere. I mean, I get it. It's only confirming suspicions that people have had for literally years at this point, but it's still worth looking into because the confirmation gives you simply more fodder to make the same sort of arguments against these social media platforms again, and also to strengthen your arguments in so many ways. And that's where I'm going to leave you guys off. If you enjoyed that video, do in fact subscribe down below. Check out my links to other video hosting websites, whether it be Odyssey or Rumble or Brighteon or BitChute. I am on all of those websites. I'm also on Minds and Parler and Gab if you want to check me out there. And check out breakingonthedaily.locals.com. I'm KelKidman. This has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.